Hello, and good day to everyone joining us from all across the world. On behalf of the IFAP Academy, I'm Praveen Chopra, and as chair of the Academy's Scientific Advisory Committee, it is indeed my privilege to welcome all of you to yet another episode of Conversations with the Academy, which is under the aegis of the Academy's value-added programs. And today, we are also particularly pleased that colleagues from our New York University community are also participating in this key conversation we're having today. Kit, moving on. Today, 2020 has pummeled us at the crossroads of a global challenge without precedent, making demands on researchers, policymakers, and governments to change traditional mindsets and address multiple dimensions which go far beyond the implications of the COVID-19 pandemic. Next slide. In the 4th century BCE, Aristotle expounded in his treatise of the Nicomachean Ethics on the relationship between individual virtue, society, and the state. Fast forward to 2021, and a year into the healthcare and socioeconomic upheaval in the pandemic, even as scientists have embarked on a race to produce safe and effective coronavirus vaccines in record time, we see a seismic shift in drug development paradigms. We confronted science being pitched versus politics. We witnessed unparalleled collaboration between biopharmaceutical rivals. We grappled with individual rights versus societal interests. And we asked of ourselves, what is just? What is fair? What is legal? And what is right? And to guide us through this minefield of emerging scenarios, what have we gleaned along this journey? And what are the implications for future drug development? We are indeed fortunate to have formidable luminaries sharing their insights and expertise with us today. Moving on, Kit. Professor Arthur Kaplan, founding head of the Division of Medical Ethics at the NYU School of Medicine in New York City, has devoted decades to researching vaccine ethics and public policy. He's internationally recognized for championing early and expanded patient access, even while advising advocacy institutions and global corporations and health organizations on balancing good science with good business ethics, a capacity in which I have personally had the privilege of witnessing art's passionate and, dare I add, provocative perspectives. Professor Sándor Kalperfornius, head of the Clinical Pharmacology Group at the Semmelweis Medical University at Budapest, is an authority on clinical drug development both in the EU level and internationally, even standing in as the head of the Hungarian Drug Regulatory Agency. And in tandem with this flair for imparting educational endeavors, that I've had the benefit of his partnership as well, Sándor is a driving force behind the ethics initiatives at the IFAP and at global clinical research forums. Over the years, my own learnings while spearheading medical affairs and clinical development at global biopharmaceuticals across challenging low and middle income markets have afforded me the advantage of driving integrated bench to bedside cross therapeutic area guidance, policies, and practices, even while advocating patient care and outcomes. So together, all of us have shared in the clinical conundrums and ethical dilemmas facing our global community. So warm welcome, Art and Sándor. And before we drive into the deliberations here, just a few concepts on setting the stage. Art, any introductory remarks reflecting on the emerging bioethical issues the year that has been?
Well, it's been quite a year, not only because of the terrible COVID plague, but the race to discover some tools to manage it. So we've seen advances in tests, we've seen advances in drugs and antibody treatments, and as is well known, we've seen rapid achievement of vaccines, particularly some using new platforms that have never really produced a vaccine before, but were well positioned, luckily, to be applied to the COVID SARS-2 virus. So from the point of view of ethics, a number of issues have emerged this year. One has been how do we know when to give emergency use approval to a vaccine? How do we decide the ratio of need and deaths occurring due to the virus and saying we're running trials and we're pretty satisfied that they are well-designed, randomized clinical trials, large scale. I'm talking now about Moderna and Pfizer and Janssen. And at the same time, if we wait to collect all the evidence we normally would wait for, we would see many more deaths in the United States and worldwide. So decisions had to be made about how to approve this vaccine, these vaccines early. Excuse me. And decisions were undertaken that I think the public may not fully understand about why they were trustworthy. For example, data safety and monitoring committees, independent, advising companies about their data. I've served on a number of these over the years, and I think they are a little understood institution, but vitally important in securing trust that data is either strong enough to merit a vaccine getting early approval, or perhaps concerning in that a vaccine may be producing adverse events. And we're seeing some of that debate right now about AstraZeneca. The independent committees, I think, then use their advice and submit it to regulators who re-review it again, in the US case, the FDA, along with advisory committees, the VRBAC as it's called. So a number of important process steps that are usually hidden, and we don't see them when vaccines are approved, but they came out into the open, and I, for one, felt confidence that when a decision was made for early use authorization of vaccines, that it was sound. And I think public trust in that decision, however, has been wavering. There's still many Americans, let's just focus here for a second, who are vaccine hesitant, who are still uncertain about whether they wish to take a vaccine. And one reason, not the only one, is that some Americans fear that the vaccines were approved too quickly, that corners were cut, and people who are anti-vaccine have been playing to that fear. So it is important to establish this pathway of approval and why that isn't true, that corners were not cut. What was decided was evidence was sufficient relative to the danger of the plague to justify an earlier release. Two other points and then I'll stop. We are now faced with a different dilemma. Following up with people to see what's going on in terms of the durability of vaccines, their efficacy against new strains. And we're not in randomized clinical trials anymore. Many of those trials have fallen apart, and we can talk about why that is in terms of people dropping out of placebo groups and so on. But we now have the challenge of real-world evidence, collecting information on people. The CDC says it has a follow-up program in place to do this. I don't know. It's never really been done at this level before, but there are questions that are going to demand answers. Durability of the vaccine, as I said, ability to protect against a variety of mutations that turn into strains that are out there, and even comparator information over the long haul. Is one vaccine better than another? Is one vaccine better that might be cheaper, which is another important question. We haven't talked about cost a lot now because governments are paying, but we soon will be discussing cost with vaccines, and that's part of the information that data and evidence is going to have to resolve if it can. The other point I want to make is that there are new vaccines still coming in the pipeline, and it's going to be hard to recruit people to these trials because we have a number of vaccines approved out there. So what are we going to do to test emerging vaccines that may be cheaper, easier to store, have more durability, may have advantages? If we can't do randomized clinical trials in the way we're used to with vaccines, tens of thousands of subjects, a good randomization with a placebo arm, I don't know that we're going to be able to pull that off going forward with the next generation of vaccines. So very interesting times. Luckily, I think vaccines will help us get our way out of this plague, but at the same time, many implications for understanding how we run trials with vaccines in the past the protections that are in there to allow us to make decisions about early approval, and what are we going to do going forward in a very different environment.
Great points, sir. You brought in the issue of trust, transparency, and where does the future lead us, especially with the whole issue of how informed is informed consent, and where do we bring in placebo? This is not, the Western world is facing this. Can you imagine what's going on in the low and middle income countries? Shandor, any thoughts on reflections on the year that has been from your top of mind ethical issues, which from the other side of the pond?
Yes, thank you very much. I think the last year was extremely interesting and still continues in this year, because it was extremely impressive how rapidly we developed the vaccines. However, then came a kind of a confounding problem. All of the vaccines presently on the market and available have an emergency use authorization, but various regulatory authorities gave emergency authorization at different level of vaccine development. Some only already after phase 2 results, while others, for example, FDA, EMA, only after phase 3 studies, these placebo-controlled phase 3 studies, which was able to determine the vaccine efficacy. So at present, the main problem, what I see, the ethical, scientific, and regulatory problems, that we have now vaccines parallelly on the market, parallelly available with different level of evaluation. So it's extremely difficult to manage that situation. And countries, for example, in my country, where we have already 7 vaccines on the market, it actually makes these differences, makes a lot of hesitation and difficulties ethically, both by the medical staff who have to administer it and by the people who will be inoculated. So what I see, unfortunately, we have not been able to develop a uniform approach for putting vaccines on the market with similar level of evaluation, and we do not have a well-regulated, uniform approach for these pandemics. I think this is a major scientific, ethical, and regulatory problem we face now worldwide, and what we face now is a very confusing maneuvering for economic, political advantages. And I think this is something which we have to understand, analyze, and try to overcome later. COVAX, which is one of the most beautiful programs for sharing benefits, did result in some success. But really, presently, we do not have a uniform, well-accepted safety, efficacy evaluation system and application of these vaccines. This is, I think, one of the main international problems which we have to face in the future.
Great point, Shandor. I think even when I'm looking at it from the lower middle income countries' perspective, it would have benefited even the local or the regional manufacturing process if the regulators and there was some harmonized approach along with the WHO, along with the regulators in the major markets, to allow for a standardized assessment, especially because patients in these trials are from the world. You've got patients from Brazil, South Africa, India, China, Russia, everywhere. But
the results will be unified.
Exactly. And they need to leverage each other. And we are working in a global community where there's so much of interdependency that it becomes even more critical that political will needs to look at the global process. So great points and a great start off. So again, to set the tone, because as you can see, we've received a host of questions in advance. They're ongoing right not now, but as soon as we start, I've got a list of questions that have come earlier from various folks we've spoken to. So let's hit the road, and maybe it'd be worthwhile setting the stage, Art and Shandor, with polling the audience. You've raised 4 buckets. We've talked about clinical trials, we've talked about challenge trials, we've talked about the issue of interdependency and travel, and we also talked about the major inequity or the non-equitable distribution of vaccines or access to vaccines. So we'll go through those 4 buckets quickly. So, Kit, can we go to the first poll question for the audience? And let's see what you can see. The idea here is, Art, you raised the question about where are the trials going from today? What is the issue going forward when we have more vaccines? There is a placebo justifiable. So here's the poll question for the audience. Let's give a few minutes for them to answer, and we will wait. Food for thought. 48% feel that the placebo arm is justified, and you can see the numbers here. Clearly, people are looking at what are the challenges with post-trial access to the patient groups regarding both the arms, and clearly the challenge around whether they would prefer for the placebo group to receive the access as opposed to high-risk groups. Art, reflecting on this, and Kit, we can shut this while we can see the speakers. Thank you.
Well, it's a very tough situation in recruiting people to trials. Many of them think, when you're saying, would you like to be in a study, and I've seen this again and again, that if you're in a study, your doctor or the doctor wouldn't recruit you unless they believed there was benefit to you. And we call that in the ethics business the therapeutic misconception. It is the idea that someone in a white coat says, come into this study, you're going to be helped. It's hard to get across to people that the reason we do a study is we don't know with certainty whether something's going to be beneficial, and that some studies run placebo arms and you may not be exposed to the new agent, but that may be good. If the new agent is harmful, you may escape adverse events that you might get from the new vaccine. So informed consent in any study is a very, very difficult thing. What makes this question relevant and even harder to answer, though, is that we're studying something to prevent a disease. Most studies try to help people with diseases, and you're recruiting someone to say, I have a new drug for cancer or ALS or diabetes or psoriasis or whatever it is, and the patient comes and hopes that their condition, if they're in the research study, will be helped, or at least that they will help somebody down the road with a similar condition. In vaccine trials with big placebo groups, nobody's sick. They're healthy. We're trying to prevent them from being sick, but that means that the risk-benefit ratio is seen as a little different. You're saying this will help you not get into trouble down the road, and many people are thinking, I don't know if I want to be in that study, because what if I do have an adverse event with the vaccine? I got no benefit and it made me worse off. So that's always been an issue in vaccine studies around informed consent. The other thing I will say is, once you get off equipoise, not being sure whether something's good or bad, and in my opinion, it doesn't take too long before you start getting off equipoise. We can argue about the statistics of it and the significance and the confidence with which someone says, let's say the vaccine is doing better. But once you start to really believe you've got something positive, it's difficult to finish a trial without opening it up to the placebo group. And some of our poll shows that people are thinking, very difficult to take a study to endpoint if you really start to see strong results, benefit in prevention, let's say against COVID, I'm going to say 2/3 of the way through the study. So normally you would want to get strong confidence that what you're seeing is really true, not just an accident of randomness. At the same time, it's very tough to hold that placebo group in place. And ethically, I'll say this, as interested to see what Sandra has to say about this. I think as soon as you start to feel you're off equipoise, as a researcher, as a sponsor, you have to tell the subjects that that is your belief in the placebo group as well, and let them drop out. Or if you're trying to recruit people to a new study with a placebo group, you need to be clear about what beneficial vaccines are easily available to them without enrolling in the trial. So that makes the placebo arm tough to manage in a way that we haven't really experienced quite in the same way before.
Just as a follow-up question to that, and this is one of the questions uppermost on people's mind. You did mention with equipoise. You also mentioned about continuing an arm. So once the placebo arm is, after a while, would need to be switched, be offered, maybe the vaccine. Is it ethical to do that? Or what are the ethical dilemmas with the drug that has not been approved, or a vaccine that has not been approved? It's still under emergency use. And even so, if it's available, would you prioritize giving it to, on one hand, balancing the individual rights to healthcare and well-being and safety, as opposed to the long-term, missing out on the long-term observation of what happens with the natural disease entity? And then at the same time, would you bring in the young, healthy volunteers getting the placebo, the vaccine, or would you prioritize other high-priority risk groups? How do you see that?
Well, first of all, it's very important to realize those questions have to be addressed upfront in the informed consent, and they're often not, and that's a problem. So you need to say to somebody you're recruiting, if this starts to look good, here's what we're going to do. You're going to stay in this thing, and we're not going to tell you, and you're going to be in this trial until it ends. So you might try to get people to consent to stay in the study until absolute endpoint is reached of statistical significance and strong confidence in the finding. I don't know that people will sign up for that, but you could try. Second, you have to tell them all their options. You have to say, look, there are 3 approved vaccines out there, or 1 is approved in your country, and we think you might be able to get it, or it's unlikely that you'll be able to get it in some countries, but there are these approved vaccines, and you could go get one right now if you were able to travel in some instances to a place where they had it. But you need to make it clear up front. Here's what's out there. And I would say, historically, Pravin, what we have always agreed is when something starts to look good, you have to talk with this committee, this data safety and monitoring committee that I mentioned, this independent group that's trying to help you assess data. And if they say it looks too good to ethically continue, you have to tell the placebo arm, you've got good data here. We think this thing is doing well, and we're going to offer you the opportunity either to drop out and get it or to stay. But I do think you have to unblind, and I think really the history of human experimentation says if you believe you have something beneficial, it's not ethical to withhold that information from study subjects.
Shandor, some comments, and I know that Art has stimulated some thought for you there too.
I have been working for many, many years with cancer patients where these ethical problems are really very critical. And we always try to do studies if the equipoise is positively answered, to try to modify the trial in order to give, after some time, with the other drug, if it's not effective, to treat the patient with a drug which we see effective. But this you can do only if you have already a statistically well-proven effect. If you do not have, you can mix up the whole trial, and you can even discard your very efficient drug, and you have to make another study. With these vaccine studies, the problem is even much more difficult. And I think that also in the future, we have to stick to the relatively short period of 6 months, because we know that the vaccine is effective. Then the people, or there are other vaccines on the market which the people can get. So people who do not know whether they are on placebo or not, they will try to find some possibility to get the vaccine. And as far as I understand, from the ongoing studies, we have seen that a lot of subjects voted by their food. They simply left the trial after 6 months and tried to get some vaccination. So this is where the patients are voting actually in favor of the ethical solution. So summing up, I think we have to stick in the future for very short placebo studies, or now that we have already some proven vaccines, we might need to start with comparative evaluation of new vaccines instead of placebo-controlled vaccine evaluation.
Robin, one more comment from me. It's also important in the informed consent. Again, we don't see it enough, but I think we should start to look for this in vaccine studies to say what will happen if the study is closed prematurely, either because it doesn't look good or more likely because it is looking good. Will vaccine be provided, as you said, to study subjects? Will vaccine then be provided to people in the nation where the study was conducted and the subjects were recruited? We sometimes have seen countries ask for that as a condition of access. But whatever the policy is, the termination of a study and what will happen to the people in it, would they get boosters 2 years later if they prove necessary? That should be addressed up front.
I have one other comment which I would like to say. I think the time is now ripe to start to make studies on high-risk people, because we do not have. Some countries began to vaccinate high-risk people, but I do not know the effect. We have to have such a studies now in children and in elderly, and whether can we make these studies by placebo control, which I don't think it would be right. Much more, such a study should be planned on the basis of comparative evaluation with a new, with a vaccine which is already proven to be good. That I just wanted to add, because children's studies are now coming up and becoming more and more important.
Great point. And we've already seen questions coming in on the panel, and one of them is very important. And I think Sam is asking, does the panel think that given the lethal nature of COVID-19 and the importance of vaccines, a degree of flexibility on the part of the regulators on the approval of the vaccine in the first instance, and then follow up with the real world data? I think we were alluding to where the real world data would also step in to give some information here. What does the panel think about that?
Well, I'll start. I think that this is the situation we're in. We basically are seeing the studies that Moderna, Pfizer, Janssen were undertaking, I know, are not enrolling any more people, and many people have dropped out to get vaccinated with the early approvals. What I was trying to say earlier is we need to make sure we have a system, and I think Sandor and Pravin are right, it had better be international, to follow people or sample of people over time to gather real world evidence as to what's going on with people now being vaccinated, whether in a high risk group or just anybody who was in the studies who dropped out. I don't think we do, my view, have a reliable system to collect real world evidence worldwide in a uniform, standardized way. I think we should try to set that up. I think that's going to be the future of a lot of vaccine studies. Once we have some approved ones out there, it's going to be hard to do placebo-controlled trials of other vaccines, as I was arguing. So even though officials at the Centers for Disease Control in the US assure me they are following a subgroup of people, I still don't think I'm convinced that it's a big enough number, and I'm not convinced that it is international and coordinated.
Great. I know we have to run along with several things, but one pending question, I think, Sandor, you also mentioned that given this evolving scenario, what about vaccines in children? And Sandor, why don't you take a stab at that first, and clinical trials in children, and then we move on to ART, because we also seen some regulators have approved clinical trials, and you've also seen Pfizer having started that. Some thoughts around that, Sandor?
I think that this should follow the general accepted guidelines of drug regulation. When a vaccine is proven to be effective in the adult population, it is absolutely time to start to make pediatric trials, especially now when we see that with the British variant, we get more and more young children infected, and they get very serious infections. So we need this study results very rapidly, and I think that it should be done with all the ethical background usually requested by law for pediatric trials. We have the background how to make it, and we should use that background, and this is safe enough.
But do you see any difference between the ethical challenges with the adults and children at this stage, given that they're not approved? B, age de-escalation is slowly starting. At this point, Pfizer has started some between up to 15 and earlier, and then we've also got studies starting from 6 months to 11 years. So, and the UK has also recently given some approval. So, do you think there are any ethical differences, challenges between the two groups? Art?
Biologically, I am not quite sure that it is. At least if it's after 3 years of age. I don't think that biologically there will be a big difference because we see that the disease is progressing very similarly in the children. The second part, what I think, is that it needs more ethical surveillance and a lot of persuasion for the parents to actively let their children participate and work together with their children within that study. That is, I think, the participation of the parents will be extremely important in that situation because they can guide their children in a way that they really participate correctly in the trial. And I think the parents will do that because they began to understand that their children are in great danger.
So I'm going to say there are two differences that I see with children. One is what we're trying to measure with children is not just death and hospitalization, but also infectivity. Can children infect others? And we basically approved the vaccines on adults, protecting against death and hospitalization, but we didn't really answer the question about infectivity. If you get vaccinated, maybe you don't die, but can you still give it to others? Kids are suspect as transmission, high transmitters to other people. So different endpoints may be involved with kids than we've seen with adults. Not that we shouldn't study infectivity with adults too, but I have a feeling part of the goal of trials with children is to measure what happens if others are exposed to them in terms of transmission. That gets harder to do depending on what country you're in, right? A lot of people vaccinated, a lot of people naturally infected already. It may be hard to see. You may need really big numbers, or somebody may say, let's take that study to a country that doesn't have much vaccination and see what's going on, which gets you into the second problem of what's the right location. If you go to a country, let's say Brazil, where the thing is out of control and you're trying to measure what's going on with children, are you doing right by the whole country in terms of also offering more vaccine supply, offering to help fix the hospital system, not just going there and being accused of being exploited? But I do think the endpoints may be different in children's studies, and I do think it may be harder to figure out what's going on in a country like the UK or the USA or Israel, where there's a lot of vaccine out there already, and there may be a lot of natural infection to measure some of these things.
Great point.
I think that you are right, but there is a problem. I think if you go to a country where a lot of environments are underdeveloped, people are living extremely jammed together, it's very difficult for those who have a schooling system, a regulated schooling system, and so on. So I think here we cannot just simply transfer data from developing countries into the developed countries. So it is a very interesting, sociologically, you should devise your trial also sociologically to answer your question.
Absolutely, and I think this is the dilemma that we're all facing as we go, and the globality of the situation. So before and I know there are lots of questions coming up. Can we move to the next one, because we're already halfway through and we've got 3 major questions to answer. Kit, can we get the next poll question to the audience, please? So here's the poll. Let's go back one. It's question 2. Yeah. I'm afraid this is going to generate a lot of debate, but it's worth asking ourselves the question, and we will keep the discussion very focused around what COVID-19 should be. So, question for the audience. And while this
can be rapidly answered.
Lovely, and I think it's going to be good and fast. But Shandor, maybe I'm going to ask you right after this if you could give just a brief, very brief, please, because we know that we have on time on what, and people can do their own research on what challenge trials should be, but how you contextualize this would be helpful. And then we'll switch to Art and ask, because he has been involved with two major organizations and even now with the One Day Sooner group that is actually looking at challenge trials in a major way, even beyond COVID-19.
So I think, thank you very much. I think challenge studies are done since Jenner made the first challenge study. Now, what are the main?
Shandor, before we go there, we just wait for the answers here, then you'll know. We'll see what the audience is like, and then we can go there.
Good.
Okay, let's stop here, Kit. I think we've already seen a range of answers, and let's see how it goes. And you can see emphatically the audience is replying yes. Now, maybe people are going away with different looks, and I know that there's a difference already between across the pond here. So Shandor, kick off and give us some perspectives of what you feel, and then we'll get Art to pitch in.
Very rapidly, I think the first thing is what can a challenge study, what type of results can us provide a challenge study? First of all, we can study whether a challenge infection can give a significant protection for a second challenge. Can it give protection to the other clades of a virus that is similar belonging to the same virus family? We can have a preliminary estimation of vaccine efficacy, which a lot of people think that would be the most important part of the challenging study. But I think clinical pharmacological and clinically the most important part is that to correlate the results of immunological studies we make after vaccine administration with a possible protection against the disease. That is the most difficult question because presently we cannot correlate our immunological results correctly and very efficiently with the protection results. One thing I would like to just mention that a lot of people, at least in Europe, are against these challenge studies because we do not understand the natural history of this disease. It can be very rapidly fatal even after a very small infection. It can cause a long post-COVID symptoms. So it's very difficult. And therefore, I am not surprised that at the end of the WHO expert meeting, they asked the participants to vote. And actually, a slight majority of the experts voted not to start challenging studies with COVID because we do not know this drug. So it's very difficult, which is difficult ethically to get a correct answer, but at this moment, many people will be against it. But in some countries, like in the UK and in the United States, they started to make that studies because they believe in its very important. In its importance. What is
you
your
raised some good points. Actually, these are the questions that need to be answered, and that is what. And you can already see the difference between the Kantian philosophy in certain European pockets and the utilitarian approach that people are taking. And UK is already going ahead. I know the US they're trying, and Canada is trying to follow suit. Art, some thoughts around the background?
So this topic, Sandor and Pravin and I could take a couple of days to go through all the ins and outs, but
exactly.
let's
we have one hour.
just make a couple of points. One is, look, there are worries about exposing someone to a viral strain and potentially making them sick, but it's not as if people aren't out there exposed to the viral strain anyway. So that the proper comparison is not, am I giving you a virus and making you worse off? It's, am I giving you a virus that you might have gotten otherwise just by wandering around in the world if you're not vaccinated or not cautious, and you get sick that way. So that may shift thinking about comparative risk. I think psychologically and morally, we do feel do no harm is a very important principle, but it comes up against the idea of harm is out there. So can a person choose to help learn about this terrible disease and vaccines, or we might use it also for antibody studies or other studies as well. So I'll just make two other points, although there's a lot more to say here. One is it's a close moral call. I've been in favor of challenge studies, but it's close.
Exactly.
So the other thing I will say is you do want volunteers. I never favored paying people because I want them to go in eyes open. I don't want people there for the money. Historically, we have run studies with no benefit to subjects, phase 1 studies, sometimes exposure to pollutant studies, but we pay people. And we have some ideas, Sandra was saying, about what the biological changes are that we're looking for to infer that this might be useful information in fighting diseases or negative impacts. And I agree, or I'll concede to Sandra, we don't always know what we're looking at when we get responses to a deliberate viral infection with a COVID strain relative to protection. But my point being, no payment. It's got to be a pure informed consent, in my opinion, with people going in eyes open. And the other thing I would say is there are dangers and risks, but we allow people to do some of this in medicine. My comparison sometimes is donating a kidney. We let people do it. I've looked at the death rates. They're not insignificant, more likely hospitalization and severe consequences to a small percentage of people who do this. But the WHO countries, the EU countries, the US, Canada, all permit living donation. So part of this is this more risky than things we allow people to do in other contexts that might be dangerous in order to benefit others, not themselves? And I think the challenge studies will pass the test. Last comment, we may be stuck with them because, as we're hinting, there may be no other way to learn or get the answer to questions since we're losing randomization with placebo-controlled trials on a large scale. All we may have left is for some studies, is the opportunity to do a challenge trial. The risks are getting a little better, starting to find antibodies and things that may help us manage a case of this, which would make the moral case stronger. But close call, but I would still say informed consent, altruistic participation, low risk, not no risk, would justify setting up challenge studies to answer questions we can't answer any other way.
I think I'm going to get both of you back after 6 months and we see how we go on this particular issue all over again. Kit, can we move to the next, because we've got two very interesting topics coming up, and I was discussing with Art and Shanda before. So what's the next poll question? The whole issue about the globality of our situation, travel, and mandates. So here's a question to the audience, and let's see how they react. And while Kit is putting up the question and the audience is thinking about it, we have been debating on two different levels here and awaiting the response about how how does this affect the Western population and those disadvantaged minorities and the low and middle income countries. Give it some thought, and then I think we've already started seeing some responses coming in a very general direction, but some thoughts from your side would be very valuable. Give it a few more minutes and we can come to that. This has also been triggered recently, as you've been seeing how the green passports have been issued, and Israel is looking at it, other markets are looking at it. It's been there for many, many years with the yellow fever vaccine being required before one can go visit some countries. But I think it takes on a very different imperative today, and that's something that we want to address. So let's stop here for a second. Kit, let's see how the audience has responded. There we go. Clearly, there is a swearing in the direction of how this could be only done if the priority groups have been covered. But let's open this up for discussion. Art, thoughts on this?
Well, I believe that even with emergency use authorization, there are some groups that should be vaccinated mandatorily. That means the presumption is that you will get it unless you have a medical excuse that wouldn't work or something. I think the healthcare workforce, people who work in nursing home settings, congregate housing with people with disabilities and so on, they ought to be vaccinated now. There's enough evidence with many of these vaccines to show that they're safe and effective. We can argue all day about the AstraZeneca one, but the other vaccines that are being used out there widely at this point, I think to protect patients and to protect the workforce, a mandate right now is appropriate. And that would be tough because some people may challenge it saying these are not licensed vaccines. They're only out there on emergency use. But I think you would win a challenge if you chose it for that group. Second point, I think mandating vaccines doesn't make sense for the general population until you can get vaccines. So there's not much point in talking about general mandates. But I do think down the road, we will see, and we're starting to see it, many businesses, not necessarily governments, but private businesses saying, if you want to come to a performance, a concert, if you want to go to a sports event, if you want to get on a cruise boat, if you want to fly, if you want to come to this hotel, you must show proof of vaccination. Not yet, because it isn't widely enough available. But I'll say this, Pravin, I am certain that we will see both vaccine passports for international travel and what I'll call vaccine authentication requirements for domestic use to gain entry to many settings. I'm not sure domestically it will be governments all the time. I think it may well be businesses who say, you know, we want to keep our customers not worrying. Many of these industries have been greatly damaged by fear of infection. I'll just end with a New York example. You know, you go to a show here, a theater show in New York, or it would be true in London. The buildings are old, they have crummy ventilation, you sit on top of one another, the crowd is old because the tickets are expensive. A lot of those people are not going to go in there again until they believe that the actors and the staff are vaccinated and the audience is vaccinated. So I think you'll see those businesses starting to ask for an app or a card or something, not in the next 3 months, but 6, 9 months as vaccine availability grows, let's say in the US, the UK, and some other places.
Chandler has already
Yeah.
started in all of this. Your thoughts?
I see a great problem now. Yes, if we want to mandate, which vaccine should be mandated? All the vaccines which were developed in the world or not? If not, all the vaccines will be mandated, and some countries come up, or an airplane society travel come up. I only accept messenger RNA vaccine. What are the people doing who were vaccinated with inactivated vaccine?
Right.
So I think here, before we discuss that, and before they put this certificate and into what we are expecting to get into practice, this has to be these questions have to be answered internationally and politically, because here it is a political will also behind it. It can't happen that the United States using mostly messenger RNA vaccines, and they say, I don't get anybody in to permit the entry of anybody into this country who did not receive that highest, the most effective vaccine. That does not help the world. So we have to come here to an internationally viable agreement which keeps international movement and international cooperation and ethics running. I express also ethics.
Great point. I think you.
And I just add to that, we also need to have standardized information. So
Exactly.
you need to get agreement on what's on your card, and when did you get
Exactly.
vaccinated, and did you get a booster, and because there will be fraud and there will be attempts to make
For
phone
sure.
papers. So you've got to get that done and protected as best you can.
You brought in a very important point about data harmonization and standardization. What is accepted across borders is going to be a challenge as we go along. But there's another element that's coming in, and that's the ethical part, where the socially disadvantaged groups, or even the countries that don't have access to vaccines, or even the younger generation, which has not yet reached that level of maybe July, and by summer, yes. Are we making them second-class citizens? Because if they don't have that, because they have no access to vaccines, what's going to happen? So this raises a very important social dilemma. But we can go on and on with this, and I think, Art, you were in a conference yesterday where you even talked about the whole thing in the global scenario about equity. So let's move to the next topic, and that's really going to engender some more questions. Kit, can we have the next poll question? Wanted to poll the audience on an issue that both Art and Shandor raised up front. How are we sharing this? What is our obligation as countries who can afford? What is our obligation to those in the rest of the world? I think it's almost demeaning to call them low and middle income countries, as if there's a schism or a schism between the two. But can we now try and bring them all together? So while the audience is answering this, let's see. You did raise two questions on data transparency and data sharing, and both Art and Shandor, you mentioned as we challenge go across borders. I think there's another very major issue coming up also, is that if we do have the vaccine supplies, why should we be sharing, and what are the guidelines? What are the ethical, political, social, logistical considerations that would drive these decisions by nations? And I think this is something that we should be looking at. Let's take a stop here. Kit, I think we've got a majority already answering. I think the jury has spoken, right? Art, what do you make of this from your perspective, your vantage point?
Well, happily, this is precisely my moral position. I think that it is important for countries to pay attention first to their own high-risk groups to get them safe. I think morally, we have some who would say, and I call them vaccine cosmopolitans, that every life is worth the same, and you should just try to distribute vaccines to the most at-risk people anywhere on the globe. But I think that ignores moral reality. We do try to take care of our families first. We do believe that it's important to help our neighbor, our community, to help people, even who are within our own countries. Even the WHO, when it's talking about vaccine distribution, still uses nations as a unit to try and think about vaccine distribution. They don't think about where the outbreak is the biggest in a region or a county or something. They're looking at nation. So get stable, handle your own high-risk groups. I would say in the US, get the death rate down. Remember, we had horrible policies regarding COVID, horrible under the Trump administration, with hundreds of thousands of unnecessary deaths. We have to get that under control. The citizens absolutely believe that, but then pay attention to the rest of the world. But I'm going to say two other things, Pravin, before I let Sandra chime in. One, I've had two discussions now with companies dealing with governments who say, we want vaccine, but what they want it for is to vaccinate their militaries and their political elite. Just saying you're going to give a country a vaccine does not mean it's going to go to the poor or the most in need or the highest risk. There are many issues that have to be recognized about the reality of vaccine distribution worldwide. And by the way, we had cheating in the United States too. I don't mean to say we're immune to this, but there are big issues there. The other point is, if you're going to start to distribute vaccines internationally, we again want to ask that people be followed, some subsample. What's going on? Sandra pointed out the world is not the same. There are people who live very closely together. There are people who have different diets. There are people who have different exposure levels. There are people that have other underlying diseases, whether it's HIV or tuberculosis or something else. We need data to come back from these programs, and I'm not hearing enough about that.
Great point. In fact, one of the questions asked in the audience is very clear also. What if the person refuses to share this data? Would deprive their individual of a vaccine? It's a dilemma.
You might.
There
I
you
mean,
go.
you might say, look, we can't ship to all countries, so if you won't send us data, we're going to go to other equally needy countries.
Exactly. Shandor, I know we are approaching the hour. Tell me.
Yes, I will be very short. I am very much surprised how much the high-risk group changed during the time. First, we only spoke of the elderly patients. Now we realize that trying to keep up education, a number of teachers died in the infection in the school. So now finally, we began, in Hungary, began a soul searching, and now we prioritize the teachers now before we restart the schooling. So it's very interesting how very difficult it is to accept what is a high-risk group. And sometimes I must tell you, I do not understand. Everywhere on the world, I see that in order to keep up international sporting, the sporters are the highest vaccinated group all over the world. Is that a correct approach? I finish that because we are at the end of the discussion.
Great point. And these are the hard conversations, and which is the somber reality that we must all engage with. And I think we should ask ourselves these questions. I was going to bring both of you to give some closing remarks, but I'm hesitating because we're already on the hour. Maybe the next webinar will be our closing remarks we start off with. It just behooves me, and I think what is really coming out clearly from all this is that there is still hope that science, and you talked of warp speed, but I love this phrase that it's the speed of science and innovation and not warp speed, and ethics, and above all, humanity shall prevail. And I think this is something that we are really looking forward to. It behooves me now just to thank, I cannot thank enough, both Art and Shandor for what you have brought to this debate here. The audience has already been perked up with the question, and hope to get more responses going forward. I'd also like to thank the audience, and again, welcoming the NYU community who were gracious enough to join us today, and our global community. I know it's very late in the eastern part of the world, but it just comes back to the point that we all in it together, and we need to challenge the future going forward. I'd like to close on this happy note and bring up the last slide, Kit, to answer, just to thank everyone, make sure that we continue together, and would welcome everyone to the next conversation, and hope this brings us some food for thought to be able to engender that debate as we go forward. Many thanks all over the world. Have a lovely day, and good luck.
Good Eastern time. Good Eastern to everyone.
Thanks, everyone.